we'll do declarations of interest. Can I bring in Archie at this point? Because we talked about the declarations of interest at the pre-meeting to do with an item later on in the agenda where there was various alios in, and with decision whether we would actually have to declare or not. Archie.
Thanks, convener. Yeah. So for the item on alios, governance and risk management oversight, obviously I've had a look at the report in light of the revised code of conduct that was issued in December last year, but in particular the guidance issued alongside the code, which is a bit more detailed in terms of members' responsibilities. So really, so far as any alio that a member has been appointed to by the council, it's clear that if it's a quasi-judicial or regulatory committee, that member shouldn't be involved in decisions. It's less clear, I have to say, when it comes to other business. However, a couple of examples are given in the guidance. One where a member of a board indicates that the board should be getting more money from the council and is then on a committee that is tasked with deciding whether or not to grant any kind of additional funding. And the other example, which is more pertinent to this item of business, is that if a member has publicly stated that a company, an alio, is performing very well, is exceeding targets, etc., and is then asked to scrutinise or to otherwise review the performance of the body, then it's that public statement that would prevent that member from participating. So I don't think in this case, unless any of the members on the panel feel that they've expressed views which fall within the parameters of this report, that they're precluded from participating. But it's obviously a matter, as always, convener to individual members, having heard what I've had to say about it.
Thanks, Archie.
Happy to take any questions, obviously, convener.
Yes. Does anybody want to ask any questions of Archie? Yes, Alan.
Archie, your first bit referenced the licensing board and the regulatory. I take it they're not an issue because I'm on both of them.
Yeah, sorry, that was just by way of where it's very clear in both the code and the guidance, Councillor Valentine, very clear that if there was a planning application or a licence application coming before either the board or the planning committee, a member who was on that alio wouldn't be able to participate. That's crystal clear. Unfortunately, as ever, that there are certain ambiguities in the guidance, but I think it boils down to out with the regulatory quasi-judicial. If you're on a panel like this and that there's any scrutiny of performance and you've publicly expressed views as to how well the alio has been doing, then I think in those circumstances you would have to declare an interest.
So I'm still not clear. Obviously, I don't express during the regulatory or the licensing board how well we're doing. I may compliment individual officers during it, but I mean, I don't put it in the papers that the licensing board in North Lanarkshire Council are brilliant or regulatory. Whether they are or not, it's not.
Sorry, Councillor, if I can just come in. It's any expressions about the alio that you sit on the board of.
Right. Okay. Right. So I'm okay to take part in this, Archie. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. If you're satisfied that you haven't publicly expressed any views that would cut across you having an unbiased approach to what's in today's report, then absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Archie. Thanks, Alan. Yes, Jim? Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just thinking how difficult this is for members. If you sit on the board of something at a meeting and say you've done a really good job in the last quarter because of the statistics you're showing us, that might fall under the category of praising the organisation. So you're in two doubts about whether you can actually be involved in an item on the committee. That's a really tough one. It's almost like if you say anything good, you can't be involved. So
I think it's anything good publicly, Councillor Hume. So it's just for your own information, members. It's paragraph 146 of the guidance, which obviously needs to be complied with in the same way that the code needs to be complied with. It has the same statutory effect. And paragraph 146 gives the example of a stakeholder event run by the outside body, the ALIO, of which you're a member, and where you have maybe stated at that stakeholder event in public how well it's done, it's exceeded all its targets and all the rest of it. And then if you're asked as a member of the council, and in particular this panel, to scrutinise something that falls within the same parameters, then clearly there's a conflict there because you've made your mind up already, I suppose, is the kind of bottom line there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Archie.
Chair, do you mind if I ask a brief non-ALIO bodies, Archie, like voluntary organisations or the CAB or something like that, what's the position if they come up on an item on a report? Is it treated in the same fashion? If you've said anything good about it, you can't really participate. Or so is there a difference between ALIOs and non-ALIOs where members are participating in those organisations?
So the guidance gives the example of ALIOs, but it also makes reference to outside bodies. I think there's a distinction, briefly a distinction to be made between a CAB where you may be on that board as an individual and not appointed by the council. So there's a distinction to be drawn there, and that then would be a matter for yourself in terms of your personal interests. Is that something where there's a potential conflict for you? But let me be clear, I'm not saying that just because you've said a body is good, perhaps at a board meeting and it's doing well, that doesn't stop you participating. It's the public expression that you've already made your mind up before you see a report like, you know, the reports that come before the panel.
That's good, thanks.
Right,
Okay,
Jim, thanks, Archie. I think on that basis, we just ask anyone if they want to declare anything. I see, Trevor, you put a declaration up, so you want to declare something. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'll just declare item agenda 11 as a director of North Lanarkshire Properties, and I'll just remove myself from the meeting if that's okay. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Trevor. Does anybody else want to declare? Are we comfortable with the rules there? Right, that's fine, thanks. Can I apologise first of all for not introducing Andrew McPherson? I didn't notice that he had actually come in. Andrew has kindly agreed to speak to us on item 4 in the agenda. So welcome, Andrew. And I'm sorry I missed you there amongst all the boxes. Thank you. So item 2 in the agenda is the presentation regarding local government benchmarking framework by Emily Lynch of the Improvement Service. Emily? Have we got Emily, have we?
Good morning or good afternoon, convener. My apologies.
It's okay, Emily, not a problem.
WebEx is new to me, so I fumbled there, so I'm really sorry.
No, that's all right.
That's great. Thank you so much for inviting me along today and for your time this morning or this afternoon. Really, we're grateful, and my colleague Esther is on the call as well. So we recently published this year's benchmarking framework report. So we thought it would be helpful, we were certainly invited to come along and just share some of the findings from this year's report and give a particular focus in on poverty and inequality. So Esther, are you able to put the slides up? And if Esther's not able to do that, I think Kirsty will do that for us. Fantastic, thank you, Esther, that's brilliant. So we can just jump to the next slide. So just very briefly, for any committee members that haven't heard us talk about the benchmarking framework before, I'll just provide a little bit of background. But the first thing to say about this year's benchmarking report is really critical, is that it's the first year that we've been able to actually publish data on the initial impacts of the COVID pandemic on our local communities and on council services. So in that respect, it's a really important evidence base for local government, because it's starting to build up that picture around about what the impacts have been, certainly in the short and immediate term. And obviously going forward in future publications, we'll start to develop an understanding about what some of the longer term impacts have been of the pandemic. So that's what we're going to talk a bit about today. But just to provide a bit of background in terms of the framework for people that haven't yet used the framework within your own work, just want to flag up that it is that synoptic high-level tool for local government, and it's a local government owned resource. So this is a resource that was designed by councils to focus in on the key council services and outcomes across all aspects of their operations. And one of the key elements for the benchmarking framework will be that we continue to evolve the framework to reflect the challenges in the changing landscape as we go forward. The only other thing I really wanted to highlight at this early stage in terms of the framework, because I think it's useful before we start talking about the data, is that the framework aims to provide a high-level suite of can openers. So they really provide that prompt to help elected members such as yourself and officers ask questions. The data in itself is limited in terms of providing the answers. So its value is in how it's used locally to dig into local performance and local outcomes, but also how it's used to engage with other council areas to learn from and to share practice and learning with other areas. And that's a critical part of the benchmarking framework. So if we start and just talk a bit about what the data shows us this year, Esther, can we jump on to the next slide, please? So there were 5 big messages, if you like, in this year's framework. So the first is that there is evidence within the framework this year of growing inequalities and poverty levels in terms of increasing financial hardship amongst our communities. So that's really what I want to talk about today. But the report also talks in more detail about some other areas that I just thought I'd flag up very briefly. First is the local government financial context. As you won't be surprised to hear in your own line of work, it's hugely complex currently, both in terms of the additional expenditure, the lost income, the undelivered savings, but also because of the additional monies provided by Scottish Government. So while it's very complex, there is continuing evidence that the funding for local government has been insufficient in order to meet the growing demands facing councils. So that picture continues to exist. And what we can see within that is then a continuation of practice where councils are protecting some areas of expenditure, and that therefore leads to growing pressure on other areas. And I'll show some of that data in a second. And then just very briefly, the report also provides some detail and some evidence around about some of the health and social care pressures we saw during this period. The pressure and the challenge has been immense in terms of delivering social care to those people that need it during this time. And as you'll all be aware, the workforce faced huge challenges in terms of managing anxieties and uncertainties, but also in terms of absence and significant recruitment issues. But what the evidence certainly shows is that certainly during year 1, in terms of 2020-21, we were able to maintain our level of provision in terms of care at home, which I think really is testament to the exceptional efforts of the workforce in that context. I think that's a really important message. Probably one of the biggest messages from this year's report is about local variation. And while we know that the impact of the pandemic on local communities and councils has been unprecedented, the individual local areas and local councils experienced the pandemic very differently. And that's very evident in this year's data. So there isn't a universal impact on the data that's consistent across the 32 councils. And from our point of view, it's that variability that's going to be incredibly valuable in terms of providing that platform to try and evaluate and learn from our approaches during the pandemic. We know that councils were both under different restrictions, they had different existing infrastructure in place. We also know, though importantly, that they employed different approaches, different responses during the pandemic. And so the data that we're publishing in the framework really is going to be helpful to start evaluating what the impact of those approaches were, and to share that practice and learning, so that as we ultimately move to recovery, we can learn from what's taken place during this period. And then just finally, just a bit about data complexity. What we've always tried to do in the benchmarking framework is allow for comparisons over time and between councils. But because of the significantly altered landscape during this period, that means that this context is more important than ever when we're interpreting the data. So it's still valuable and useful information, and as I say, the variability is perhaps more useful than ever. But the fact that different areas had different operating contexts during this time and different approaches during this time is something that we're going to really need to factor in. So that's some of the background. So just first, before we go on to poverty and inequality, I just want to briefly talk about some of the financial data that we're seeing this year, particularly in relation to North Lanarkshire Council. So what we had been seeing over the long term is that because of the pressure on local government budgets, there had been increasing evidence that councils were protecting some areas of expenditure and there was growing pressure in other areas. And this graph shows this. The orange line is North Lanarkshire and the blue line is Scotland. And you can see in the bottom of the graph, those areas such as adult social care, services for children who are looked after, and education have largely been protected and expanded both at Scotland level but also for North Lanarkshire. But that then means we're seeing much bigger reductions in other service areas, many of which we're seeing reduced by up to and over 30%, which is clearly significant. North Lanarkshire largely follows the Scotland trend. The only area where there's real divergence is in relation to support services, whereas across Scotland, we're seeing a 30% reduction. In North Lanarkshire, there's been an increase in expenditure in this area during the last 11 years. But I think of more interest is the next slide, Esther, because this actually shows what's happened to expenditure in the year 2021. And what it immediately highlights is much more variability than we've been seeing over the longer term. So what you can see here, again, the orange lines are North Lanarkshire, so you can really see where the pattern of spend during 2021 diverges significantly from what we're seeing at a Scotland level. And if I pick a couple of these, you can see that in economic development, while at Scotland level it increased by about 10%, in North Lanarkshire it increased by 30% during this period. Now we know that the COVID discretionary fund support is going to be significant, and we understand that I think the way that councils allocated this and the extent to how much was carried forward is probably going to play some part in understanding the difference there. Another area is environmental services, because at Scotland level, this reduced in expenditure by 1%, whereas in North Lanarkshire we saw an 8% increase in expenditure on environmental services during this period. And certainly part of the explanation of that was given by the authority was around about the social distancing measures that had to be put in place. But we know again that that will be true for all councils. So I think it will be interesting to understand a bit more about what were some of the other factors that perhaps help us understand that divergence. Culture and leisure, I think, is one of the most interesting ones for North Lanarkshire because there's such a difference here. So while across Scotland there has been a reduction in expenditure during 2021, in North Lanarkshire there was an increase in expenditure of over 20%. And the explanation for that, again, was around about supplier relief payments to ALIOs to compensate for lost income, which again makes absolute sense. But because we know that that will be the case for many authorities, again, it will be interesting to understand and unpick that a bit further to see is there anything else that might be making the difference in that trend. And then the final one I just want to pick up in that graph is around about education, because while we saw continued protection of education expenditure across Scotland, in North Lanarkshire there was a real terms reduction. While you won't be surprised to hear that expenditure in early years continued to grow significantly during this period, in the most recent year, expenditure on both primary and secondary education reduced in North Lanarkshire, which was counter to the trend that we were seeing across Scotland. So it may well be that that's explained by demographic practices, or there may be other explanations. But some of those differences, again, are the can openers that I mentioned at the beginning that hopefully will kind of stimulate some of the local discussions. But if we move on to the next slide, what we really wanted to do today was to share some of the data from the framework that allows us to focus in on poverty and inequality. We know that that's a priority area for yourselves as for other council areas. So we've picked some of the indicators in the framework that we know from analysis are systematically related to the level of deprivation in your local communities, so that we can use this to help us understand some of the patterns that are emerging both at a Scotland level, but importantly what's happening at North Lanarkshire. So what we've got in the slide in front of you, on the left hand side, we have a graph that shows what the averages are for groups of councils based on the level of deprivation. So if you look at the top line, the blue dash dot dash line, I don't know, Esther, if you can point to that line, but if you, yeah, that one there, that line represents councils who serve communities with the lowest levels of deprivation. So we call that the least deprived council line. And then the light blue line at the very bottom, Esther, if you can point to that, that line represents, that's it there, that represents councils that serve communities with the highest levels of deprivation. So, and then the red line in the middle is your Scotland average. So this graph allows us to just visually show the difference between council areas by deprivation. And then on the other side of the page, what we do is we take the councils that are similar to North Lanarkshire in terms of the overall level of deprivation in your authority. So we call this your family group, and this allows you to make comparisons with other council areas that are serving communities that have a similar level of deprivation to your own communities, and that hopefully gives you a similar sort of a context. So this analysis will help us understand a bit about some of the trends that we're seeing. So first we want to start with looking at literacy levels in primary children. Now, what we know in terms of literacy levels is that across Scotland there's been a general decline in literacy levels in the most recent data, and you can see that in terms of the left hand side. You can see the red line going down and all the other dotted lines going down. But the key message here is that the decline has been far less pronounced in those council areas that serve less deprived communities. So if you like, there's that attainment gap that's widening across this period, and there's been a very sharp reduction in councils that are serving the most deprived. If we look at the family group here, there's a really interesting story for North Lanarkshire, because North Lanarkshire has not shown, while it has declined slightly, it's not declined at the same rate as the family group. So therefore, in comparison with other councils that have similar levels of deprivation, North Lanarkshire is faring pretty well. And we would expect that other councils in your family group would be keen to explore with North Lanarkshire a bit more about what the approaches have been here to deliver and to support this level of performance. And if we move on to the next slide, which is about numeracy, it's exactly the same trend that we're seeing. So an overall decline across the country, less deprived councils, not falling as sharply, so therefore the attainment gap widening. But again, North Lanarkshire not showing the same level of decline as other councils in their family group. So their performance is holding up, and relatively speaking. And you can see there that some of the councils, in terms of, for example, you can see the orange, which is East Ayrshire, and the green of North Ayrshire, showing a really sharp decline during this period. And I would expect that they would want to speak to yourselves to learn a bit more. If we move on to the next slide, and we want to talk a bit about school attendance rates, because again, we know that this has a relationship with deprivation. So again, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, what you can see is that councils with lower levels of deprivation tend to experience higher school attendance rates, and those councils with higher deprivation have lower attendance rates. During COVID, what we saw was generally speaking, most councils reduced their attendance rates, but the reduction was sharper for councils that experienced the highest levels of deprivation. So again, that attainment, that gap is widening. And if we look at the family group graph, what we can see here for North Lanarkshire is a really quite sharply declining attendance rate during this period. And now in the family group has the lowest level of school attendance. So again, that's an area where it may be of interest to speak to other councils to find out what they're doing. And even within the family group, there is one council, it's a light blue line. Don't know, Esther, if you can point to that, but there's one council in the family group, that one there, it's Inverclyde, and they've maintained their attendance levels during the COVID period, which is counter to the national trend and counter to the family group trend. So it might be interesting to find out a bit more about how did they achieve that? What did they put in place that was able to deliver that level of performance? If we move on to the next slide, children living in poverty, once again, there's a relationship with deprivation, in that councils with the lowest levels of deprivation have lower levels of child poverty, which will not be a surprise, unfortunately. And you can see that in the graph. Again, what you can see in the family group graph is an increase in levels of poverty across the family group. For North Lanarkshire, what you can see is quite a sharp increase in the most recent year that we have data for, and this data only goes up to 1920, so it's worth highlighting that the new data is not out for a couple of months. So there is quite a sharp increase in the most recent data points. There's a couple of councils in the group, but particularly Western Bartonshire, that's the brown line at the bottom. So again, it might be interesting to explore with them to find out a bit about what is it that's different in their setup and their arrangements that might be leading to that lower level of child poverty rates, because we know that rising child poverty rates is something that's happening across the country. So any learning that exists is going to be incredibly valuable. If we move on to the next one, children meeting developmental milestones, again, a similar trend, that the light blue line at the bottom is the average for the most deprived councils, and you can see here that again there's a relationship with deprivation. So children living in council areas where there's higher levels of deprivation are less likely to be meeting their developmental milestones. And here I think there's a really interesting story for North Lanarkshire, because you can see in the right-hand side that the level of children reaching their developmental milestones is comparatively very high in North Lanarkshire compared to every other council in your family group. So again, I would be expecting other authorities to think that there's maybe some interesting learning there. So it'd be useful to explore what are the key factors locally that might be driving that. So I won't go through all of the examples we've got here, because I think we've got quite a lot. I'm happy to talk about any others, but it'd be good to kind of open it up for discussion. But there's two others that I just wanted to draw our attention to. So Esther, if you go to slide 14, which is rent arrears. Thank you. We think this one's a really interesting one as well for North Lanarkshire, is that rent arrears, generally speaking, have increased over time, but they've increased really sharply in the last 12 months, partly as a result of COVID. What we're seeing here, interestingly, is a sharper increase for councils with lower levels of deprivation, which is perhaps counterintuitive. But nonetheless, we're seeing an increase in general terms across Scotland. But if we look at North Lanarkshire's trend, we've actually seen a decrease in rent arrears across the past 2 years for North Lanarkshire. Now that's really interesting because that's absolutely bucking the national trend. So again, it would be interesting to understand, do we know what the factors are that are delivering that level of performance and that counter trend? Because there's clearly learning that can be shared wider across local government to help other areas that are really struggling with their levels of arrears. And the next slide is similar to this. This is about council tax collection. And what the graph on the left shows is a real significant reduction in council tax payments in the most recent year. Again, perhaps not unexpected as a result of COVID. So a very sharp reduction. And again, we saw a sharper reduction in councils that experience higher levels of deprivation, really indicating that financial hardship in local communities. And what we can see for North Lanarkshire is while they follow this national trend, so they've also shown a reduction in their council tax payments during this period, it's a slightly less severe or pronounced reduction than some other council areas. Because if you look at North Ayrshire, Glasgow and East Ayrshire, they've all seen their collection rates reduce at a sharper rate than North Lanarkshire. So again, I think there is some potential learning that might be gained from that. And then Esther, if we can just jump to slide 20, and I'll just finish on this one. This one is around about our living wage. So it's a really interesting one for councils. So this looks at the proportion of people that earn less than the living wage. And what we can see during over time is an overall improvement. So there's been a drop in the number of people earning less than the living wage, but there's a couple of interesting stories behind this which might be relevant for you. So the first is that not all council areas have seen a drop in this area. And during COVID, those council areas that had the lowest levels of deprivation, they actually saw an increase in the number of people earning less than the living wage during this time. So again, that's going to be an interesting trend to fully understand. But the other factor which might be of more relevance to North Lanarkshire is that while overall we saw a drop in the number of people earning less than the living wage, what we saw as a result of COVID is that the lower paid people were at greater risk of losing their jobs. And so therefore, if they did lose their jobs, which is what the evidence indicates, is that the impact that had was that overall average earnings for those people that remained in work has actually improved. So that could account for some of the drop. So I think what that does is it highlights some of the complexity that's underneath this high level data and the need to really explore it in more detail with your officers and for them to explore it with other councils to fully understand what's happening in other areas. You can see for North Lanarkshire, they did experience a drop, or you did experience a drop in the people earning less than the living wage during this period. So it would be important to understand to what extent that was impacted by people losing their job at the lower end of the income stream. So as I say, we love talking about the LGBF. There's lots of data in there and we could talk forever. So I've tried to select some of the indicators which are probably of most relevance when we're talking about poverty and inequality, but there's a raft of other pieces of intelligence within the framework that will be useful in this area if you want to, or you're interested in exploring it further. But I'll stop at this stage and, you know, would welcome any questions or comments from members of the committee.
Thanks very much, Emily. The graphs are really interesting. There's a lot to take in there too. Is it possible for the councillors on the panel to get copies of these graphs sent to them? Is that possible?
Absolutely.
So more time then to sit and study them and take them in. So that's fine. Can we ask now for any comments or questions on Emily's presentation? Does anybody have anything? Jim, yes? Oh, you're on mute, Jim. You're on mute.
Sorry,
Okay.
I guess I would have questions on almost every page in the report, and some of the things that come to mind are economic, on the bar chart, economic development and tourism, North Lanarkshire 30%, Scotland 9%. That's a significant difference, but it's less significant if the total amount spent on it is £25,000 going up to 36,000 or whatever it is. So the percentage is absolutely correct, but the figures are bring relevance and meaning to that. So I presume the figures are in the report. Things like it seems to be a contradiction between reduction in numeracy and literacy and increase in pupil development. You know, I don't understand that. So I'd need to know how pupil development was assessed if numeracy and literacy are declining. Things like council tax arrears increase, and I don't remember that from being significant from our financial reports in the council. So that's the type of thing I would want to ask about. So Sandy, your comment about receiving the report and giving us time to fully assess it is completely relevant. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. And I think Emily would be quite happy, once we've had a chance to look at it, to go back to Emily with any questions that we could have on it. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? That's great. Well, that's what we'll do, Emily. If you send, oh, sorry, Alan, yes.
On the chat bar, Sandy.
All right.
I'm on the chat bar.
How's it going this way?
It was a comment regards the rent, where we're not decreasing our rent collection, and that's because the housing department within North Lanarkshire Council brought in a universal credit fund, because when people apply for universal credit, it takes 6 to 8 weeks for the national government to sort it out. So we brought in a fund there that would cover those people for that, and they could pay it back over a period of time. So that's why that's there, and that's a good news story as far as North Lanarkshire and the housing department particularly is concerned. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Alan. Have we any more comments or questions? Are we okay? Fine, Emily. What we'll do is if you send everybody a copy of that, and then be prepared for all the emails coming with the questions. So thank you very much for the presentation. Really interesting. I found it really interesting. So thank you, Emily, and thank you, Esther. And we'll let you go rather than having to sit through the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
We go on to the agenda item 3. Is the audit and risk related items action log, and Ken's going to speak to this. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, convener. Members will note that all the actions brought forward have been addressed, with the exception of one item which related to a request from September 2020 that the next time a report was submitted to the Policy and Strategy Committee on the Council's whistleblowing arrangements, that then be remitted for the panel for consideration. Those members who are on Policy and Strategy will know that a report from Archie was considered by Policy and Strategy last week, or the week before, and that has now been remitted to the panel for future consideration. So obviously that will take place the next time this panel or its equivalent meets. And that's it. There's no other matters arising from the report, I don't think.
Thanks, Ken. Does anybody have any questions or comments on item 3? We okay with that? Okay, thanks very much. We go on to agenda item 4, which is page 9, which is the internal audit progress report. That's you again, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, convener. This report does a number of things. It presents members with an overview and update on completed audit work in accordance with the plan. It seeks the panel's consent to changes which are proposed to the annual plan to reflect change level of internal audit resources during the year. And then there's a couple of other items at the end of the report relating to the National Fraud Initiative and internal audit's own performance. If I can go back now to page 10, section 2, and really just reflect on the audit reviews completed in the period. There were 4 part of the substantive audit plan programme of work. None of those completed reviews have anything other than positive assurance, although obviously each of them have raised a number of issues and areas for management consideration. Probably the one that I would want to highlight in terms of the kind of core work we've done is really the report on corporate governance, which was designed to provide assurance on the adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's arrangements in respect of two of the particular principles within the Living Good Guidance framework, and also reflected on management's progress of previous audit recommendations on other principles, and also reviewed the current arrangements around the Council's strategic governance and strategic self-evaluation frameworks. So quite important parts of how the Council goes about assessing the extent to which it is meeting the required standards. You'll see it at paragraphs 2.9 to 2.13, the comments in relation to that, and I'm quite pleased to say that's quite a positive report, both in terms of the work we did in relation to principles A and B, which cover sort of integrity, ethical values, respecting the rule of law, openness and stakeholder engagement. But also, crucially, you'll see it at paragraph 2.10 and 2.12, quite positive comments from us in respect of the approach that the Council's taken forward in terms of the strategic governance framework, which obviously this panel has heard quite a bit about over the previous period. So actually happy to report really that process is robust and effective, and the panel I think should take some assurance from that. The other audit report I really just want to highlight, and obviously we'll take questions on any of them, but really is just in relation to the investigative report on waste and fleet, in relation to a matter which came to our attention through a previous payroll audit, and there was sufficient come out of that payroll audit to require us, I think, to do further work to look at the circumstances surrounding what appeared to be excessive overtime payments, which could have been indicative of control weaknesses or irregularities, which we considered warranted further investigation. The outline of our conclusions are summarised in paragraphs 2.22.25 to 25. Obviously, Andrew's here to deal with any particular issues and questions arising from that, but you'll see from the report that we did identify, some significant control failings within the services arrangements, really some fairly basic concerns around the processes in place for authorising and monitoring overtime, as well as a range of other things. I'm pleased, and I think the panel should probably focus on the fact that the management have responded very positively to the report's findings and recommendations, and since reviewing the report, have already taken forward a range of actions with others planned, which will hopefully address the underlying weaknesses which we identified, and will make the appropriate arrangements more robust and moving forward. In terms of the section on changes to the audit programme, members may be aware that around half my team were temporarily seconded to other duties in the months of January and February, really in response to pressures that were existing across the organisation, and particularly in terms of administering business support and self-isolation grants as part of the response to the Omicron wave. That's needed to be reflected in the plan, and in determining which resources which assignments which we'd not yet undertaken or completed this year. You'll see the rationale for the decisions I've taken at paragraphs 2.27 in terms of how I've prioritised those. I'm pleased to say that all staff are now back, and so subject to the confirmation that the panel's content with that, we will proceed on the basis of this report in terms of completing the necessary work in order to prepare the annual opinion I'm required to provide at the end of May. National Fraud Initiative section, really just a final, almost a kind of closing assessment of that process. You'll see from the narrative there that exercise, which started back in October 2020, has now effectively reached a sort of natural close. The longer you investigate issues arising from matches further away from when the matches occurred, the less value there is in doing so. We obviously, as members will be aware, approach that exercise on a kind of very prioritised risk basis in terms of those exercises and issues that we follow up. And so we've provided what is effectively a kind of closing summary position for the panel. And then finally, in sections paragraph 236 onwards reflect on the internal audit performance framework, which members approved last year. Some of those indicators are quarterly, some of them are reported at the year end, and we're providing a snapshot in terms of those indicators which we report quarterly. And you'll see there that those provide a generally, well, hopefully they provide a kind of generally positive assessment of how internal audit is perceived by key stakeholders. And obviously we've given some commentary there in terms of how we deal with issues arising from the feedback that we get. So that's the kind of report. Obviously you've got the full audit reports in the pack, but I'm happy to take any questions, Convener.
Thanks, Ken. I see you've got a question, Jim, but I think maybe before we take your question, Jim, we'll allow Andrew McPherson to come in, maybe just to comment on page 62 and the various items there that are discussed. Andrew, do you want to say something now before we open it to questions?
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I'd just like to echo Ken's comments there, just that we have taken this in a positive way. Just as Ken has said, there definitely has been, we have dropped the ball when it comes to, you know, all of the proper checks that should be in place. What I would say though, and I'm not offering any excuses here, but in mitigation that waste and fleet run on overtime that's a necessary part of the job. But where we have, for example, environmental health, where we have 20 people in a pool in a team, then if somebody's off for that day, then that's fine. That work can either be done the next day. If they're off for a week, it can be done the following week. Or if they're off for a long period of time, then it can be split amongst the other 19. Within waste and fleet, is very much a case of if somebody phones in ill that day, that person needs covered that day. So it's a very different animal from normal overtime cover. So and there is an element of complacency has crept in. I freely accept that. And I think the actions that we're now taking will certainly address all of the recommendations that have been mentioned in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Jim, you've got a question?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. First one, if I could ask Ken to give us some sort of reassurance, if possible, that at a time of so many changes and changed way of working and impacts of the pandemic to people's roles and people's jobs, that I would have thought that would have been a time when a department like internal audit would have spent more time making sure things that were running to new procedures were being operated properly. So I was surprised and disappointed that Ken had to give up staff. I understand why it happened, but can Ken reassure us that, and I've seen nothing to suggest it's not, but can Ken reassure us that it's not likely to be an ongoing thing, and indeed they didn't feel that losing the staff impacted internal audit's ability to do a proper job in light of all the changed circumstances that the council's operating under?
Yeah,
I ask that question, so that's...
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that, Convener. I mean, there's two elements to that, and I'll take the latter part first. I mean, in terms of, you know, internal audit giving up resources and the impact that's had on our operations. I mean, clearly we're a function which, you know, our kind of outputs are pretty closely correlated, and our ability to kind of, you know, do audit coverage is reasonably correlated to the number of bodies I physically have to do the work. So clearly it has had some impact, and that's one of the reasons I'm being open and transparent in terms of the impact that's had on our ability to conclude the 21-22 annual plan. I think, and as I've said in the report, that will not impinge on our ability to provide the necessary year-end annual opinion. So, you know, I think we need to reflect on the fact that, you know, where we're setting up often quite complex arrangements, quite, you know, kind of bureaucratic processes with risks of fraud and irregular transactions, that audit staff are likely to be seen as valuable by those who are running these functions, because they have a good sense of, you know, risks and the potential for errors. In terms of the wider point, the first point you made about the extent of different ways of working, I mean, that's been very much part of our audit approaches and our audit coverage over the last, well, now 2 years, obviously. And we've done, you know, a significant amount of work with management around both the planning and design of services in the initial stages, where we were moving from, you know, particularly in functions, you know, where there's lots of, you know, financial transactions and money going out the door. So predominantly things like payroll and creditors. You know, we've done probably a disproportionate amount of audit work in those areas over the previous 2 years, as well as working quite closely with, well, primarily Elaine and her team in terms of, you know, what arrangements were being put in place, and we were very much on part of the kind of the team that were looking at that in terms of, you know, designing and implementing those in the early days of the pandemic. So we're obviously now at the period, that part where in future changes to the operating model, we're actually probably going to keep much of the you know, the arrangements that we put in place across the organisation around, you know, enhanced digital processes, and as we move towards a more hybrid operating model. So a lot of that work that we did at the early days, I think, will be, you know, quite valuable. But, you know, we'll continue to focus on those risk areas where, you know, where there are significant new working arrangements, and that's just an integral part of our audit coverage. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. Jim, you've got another question?
Yes, it's to do with the waste report, Chair. I'm sorry Andrew's had to come again and explain the circumstances of why there was such a negative report on aspects of the operation of waste services. And Andrew's comments really don't satisfy me in terms of the management response. The recommendations, agreeing to them is fine, but the questions I would like to ask is, why did it take an internal audit review to find these issues? If I was a manager in that organisation and I saw waste operatives earning around £60,000 in wages and £30,000 in overtime, I would have thought that would have triggered some questions. And it's not just the overtime, Andrew. There's the recruitment processes that were frankly a debacle as well, in terms of people being employed in roles that they weren't qualified for, taking up the role before they were given the offer. And opinions like, I'm delighted to get a promoted role and I'll make up the difference in the salary and the previous salary with overtime. And then managers signing off on that without overtime being authorised in anything. Andrew, I don't think it's fair to pin you down to answer these questions just now, but I certainly need more detailed explanations of what went wrong here, and indeed a deeper dive on why it was allowed to happen. I don't think this is a place in this panel to do that. I'll to
lost you, Jim. I think we got the gist of what Jim's actually.
The income that they were identified in the report.
We lost you just at the end there, Jim. Just
Right.
at the very end, it cut off.
No, I don't think the panel's the place to do the deep dive on everything that was identified in the report that had gone wrong. I'll try and take that up out with the panel. I don't know what other members feel about it, but perhaps they might want a full report to be brought back to the panel. I don't know, but I want more detail on this and why it was allowed to happen.
Right, Jim, thanks. I think Ken's wanting it at this point. Ken?
Yeah, I really just wanted to just also give the panel assurance that obviously in response to the audit report and the management commitments, that we will be doing some follow-up work in due course to make sure that the actions which Andrew has put in, has committed to put in place are in place and are proving effective, so that the panel will hopefully get some assurance in the future as to the adequacy of arrangements within the service.
Right, Ken, thanks. So Jim, how would you want, Archie, okay, Archie first then. Archie?
Thanks, convener, and it may be that I'm misinterpreting what Councillor Hume is saying, but can I just remind members that obviously there's a difference between your strategic role and the operational role that officers carry out, and that extends to the management within a service and indeed any issues around any fault, dare I say it, which might give rise to a disciplinary process. So apologies if I'm reading too much into what's being said, convener, but simply as monitoring officer, just want to throw that caveat in that obviously this panel has a supervisory role in terms of scrutiny, and it seems to me that it's carrying out that function in terms of Ken's report. But I'll leave it there unless there's any questions on that, convener. Thanks.
Thanks, Archie. Andrew?
No, listen, I completely understand, Councillor Hume, and the point you're making, and obviously I've come here fully prepared to answer all the questions, but I do acknowledge and actually thank you for rather than going into the detail of this. I don't think it's perhaps it's not the right thing. I'm more than happy to do whatever it takes to sort of provide those assurances. I think the thing for me is that the proof's in the pudding. You're perfectly right, Councillor. You need to find out why it happened and then assurance that this doesn't happen again. It was the service that asked for audit to come back in a period of 6 months. Now, whether that report in itself, the findings of that report in 6 months' time, which will do a deep dive into the recommendations that have been put forward, and will be hopefully a much better place to provide them with much greater detail at that point. Perhaps a further report to the Audit and Scrutiny panel provide further detail that might be.
I'm sorry, I can't hear Andrew. Is anyone else? I can't hear Andrew. Is anyone else experiencing that?
You're having difficulty hearing you, Andrew.
So, my apologies. This does seem to happen with WebEx for some reason. Can everybody hear me okay now?
Yeah,
Yes,
you're
that's
okay
better.
now. Yeah,
Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, I like I say, Councillor Hume, I totally accept all the comments that you've made there, and I think it was the actual service itself that asked internal audit to come back in a period of 6 months to actually review these recommendations and undertake that deep dive, which I think is necessary going forward. And if maybe as a way forward in itself, if that further report from internal audit was to come back to audit and scrutiny in that time period as well, if that would provide the further clarity and detail that you were seeking for, and obviously I accept Archie's point. I don't think there is any intention of doing anything that untoward in your comments, Councillor Hume. So I'm more than happy to if that's a way forward. If we could, I can certainly work with Ken in that as to the report that comes back at a further period in time.
thanks, Andrew. Ken, are you fine just acting as a middleman here and liaising with Andrew and the Audit and Scrutiny panel in due course to maybe do more of a deep dive in this?
Yeah, I think we need to be conscious of our role as well. I think I recognise fully Archie's concerns that the panel doesn't involve itself in kind of detailed operational matters. Clearly the kind of detailed oversight of any individual service, responsibility for that lies with the relevant service committee. So, I suppose theoretically, and I'm just talking out loud here, and I might get things mentally, physically thrown at me by fellow officers, but obviously the panel, if they were sufficiently concerned about the generality of the issues raised, could ask, refer the matter to the service committee, who've got much more, direct operational oversight. But other than that, I'm happy to work with Andrew to take on board any comments from panel members, and to, as I say, the intention would always be to bring something back. I think from from my perspective, the important thing for the panel, yes, is to get some comfort that lessons have been learned as to why the circumstances highlighted in the audit report were allowed to occur, and crucially that those matters are addressed going forward. So I'm happy to do that.
Thanks, Ken. Jim, are you comfortable with that It'll be brought back to the audit and scrutiny panel for the next meeting or whatever, whenever Ken can get it done.
I think the first comments are still relevant, Chair. I'd be delighted for the response, the department's response to the recommendations to be brought back, to give everyone the reassurance that everything that's identified and the recommendations have been complied with. And frankly, I completely understand Archie's point. I wasn't suggesting that this panel was anything other than an audit and scrutiny panel. But I think if this wasn't a council, I would be saying to the people in the department, why has this happened? And I completely understand responses like it's been allowed to happen and HR have been involved, and that is frankly, if it was private organisation, there'd be elaboration for that, and public bodies that covers it. We're not entitled to know what the HR implications are, but I feel perfectly entitled to ask, and particularly in light of the previous payroll exam that identified issues, why it took another internal audit assessment to find all of these other irregularities within the processes within the organisation. I'm just thinking personally, if I did a previous internal audit report that said there were flaws in the system, I would have dealt with them, and I presume lots of people would. So I need to understand why they weren't dealt with and why internal audit had to find all these other issues. And I said at the start, I don't think this panel is the way to do that, but I'll try and follow that up as best I can. Thanks.
Right, Jim, thank you. Ken and Andrew, are you fine just liaising and do a further report to come to the next, or hopefully next audit and scrutiny panel? Are you fine with that, Ken? Yeah, Andrew? Yeah, thanks. Can I just ask one other thing? I noticed on page 14, the 7 frauds. I mean, it's only 34,000, but 34,000 is quite a lot of money. Are we pursuing that to get the money back, Ken? Sorry, Ken.
Apologies, I was struggling to come off mute there. Yeah, some of those cases are currently with the police, so I wouldn't want to say an awful lot more on them at the moment, if you don't mind.
They're with the police. That's fine. That's
yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Is everybody fine with that?
Councillor Valentine's got his hand up, Chair.
Yes, sorry, Alan. Yes, on you go, Alan.
Sandy, come on. Keep your eye on the screen.
It's just my eyes kind of go 2 directions.
I mean, I've got some grave concerns, as is Councillor Hume, with the waste overtime issue. Now, in the papers, it tells us that this has been running for 3 years. Now, I don't know how long a period it takes for something to flag up. Is it a 2-year period? But when somebody's earning almost half a gain of his wages every year, sorry, I said his there, and I don't know if it's a him or a her, so my apologies for that. The person who was doing that, it seems to have been too long in coming to light, in my opinion, when it's been going on for 3 years. It's all well for Andrew to say lessons learned, but in my opinion, the lessons should have been learned and it should have been dealt with quicker. And there seems to be a lack of, can I say, middle management, as opposed to Andrew himself, because obviously he will not deal with that specifically. So my concerns are similar to Councillor Hume's, and I hope that the audit that comes in 6 months' time will have sorted this position out. Now, I remember, I've been here for a wee while now, and I remember years and years ago, somebody got a wage and they had double their wage, and somebody inquired about it, saying this guy's making more than the leader of the council. And the answer to that one was, at the time, and I'm not saying that anybody should tell me the answer to this one at the moment, but the answer to that one at the time was, this was a plumber who was on call 24/7, and he was amongst a group of plumbers, and he was the only one that had no life, if you understand what I mean. He was on call and he took every call he could over that period, and that's why his wages were so exaggerated, so much overtime more than everybody else. So that was a reason for that one. And Andrew's already pointed out that when you've got a group of 2 or 3 people that are doing the same job, as opposed to a group of 20 people, you can cover when it's 20. You can't necessarily cover when it's 2 or 3, so you have to bring overtime in. So I understand that, but it was just that wee bit background, a bit previous. And that's my comment. My question, and it's similar to yourself, Chair, was that in paragraph 232, the fraud part of it, they say that there was resulting 7 frauds and 696 errors. That relates to errors arising from housing benefit and council tax reductions. To put that into context, do we know how many transactions were taking place on that, so that we can say, well, 696 errors was 1%, or 696 errors was 50%? Because if we understand the percentage of that, then we can understand whether it's a very small problem or whether it's a major problem. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Alan. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, convener. And I'll take the first item that Councillor Valentine raised in relation to the historical plumber who, I'm afraid, predates my arrival, but obviously has gone down in the annals of history. What I would say there more generally is that, you know, we have quite complex pay arrangements. Andrew's already mentioned some of the complexities he has in terms of delivering his service. Clearly, given the range and scale of activities that the council does and the diverse range of those activities, you know, we have, to be perfectly blunt, extremely complicated pay arrangements in terms of some of the kind of the differences between core and non-core hours and different levels of overtime rates and all sorts of different working patterns, and you know, so the system is inherently complex. On the other hand, you know, we have consistently from our audit work, you know, provided the panel with positive assurance about the adequacy of the controls around payroll, notwithstanding 1 or 2 you know, areas of interest over a few years ago. So the preventative and detective controls we'd expect to see within the system are there, and as the audit report points out, you know, the sorts of issues that Councillor Valentine and Councillor Hume to some extent were referencing were not systemic errors. They were errors in terms of, you know, people not accessing and doing something with reports that they were provided. So everybody who's a budget holder, you know, gets a plethora of reports on pertinent matters relating to their areas of budget responsibility. But those reports in themselves are only valuable if somebody obviously does something with them. And you know, as the audit report says, you know, there was a clear failure to do this sort of, you know, month to month, week to week monitoring and to ask questions and take actions on that, you know, as a result. So hopefully, as I say, that more generally, you know, the panel can take comfort from the work that we've done on payroll, which obviously features fairly prominently and regularly in our programme, given the number of employees and the amount of transactions that go through. In terms of the second point about kind of contextualising the housing benefit errors, I mean, clearly that is a very germane point. I don't have the number of transactions to hand. We can certainly provide that. But what I would say is that, again, historically, the work that we've traditionally done on housing benefit has provided the panel with, you know, I think quite positive levels of assurance about the robustness of the control arrangements that we have in place across the various aspects of the administration of housing benefit and council tax reduction. And you know, it's not an area I think that I would see as, you know, a particular area of concern. It's one where, you know, one needs to be mindful always of the potential for error. but it wouldn't be an area I see as of particular risk, and I don't know whether Elaine has any particular comments you'd like to add to that.
Elaine, have you anything you want to add there?
I would just add that 696 is, I would expect, extremely low percentage of the total number of transactions that go through, but like Ken, I don't have the figures to hand.
Right, Elaine, thanks. Alan, are you fine with that, or you want to ask anything?
No, I'm fine with that, and obviously as my group's lead on housing for a number of years, I don't expect that to be a high percentage. I was just looking for it in context so that everybody on the committee could understand. If it's 1% or less than 1% or whatever, then it's not a major concern. That was all I was looking for, and I don't expect it to be a high percentage. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. Have we any more questions? Any comments? Are we fine? So as far as agenda item 4 is concerned, the panel is invited to note the findings, conclusions and recommendations of the internal audit reports together with the associated management responses. We've actually agreed to item B, which is consider whether there are any issues raised by internal audit which the panel consider sufficiently significant to require a further report from management to be submitted to a future meeting of the panel. And we've agreed that one. And item C, request that internal audit provide a report for future meetings of the panel, reporting progress made by management, implementing agreed management actions in relation to all audit recommendations categorised as high or medium, and otherwise note this report. Are we agreed to that? Agreed to note it? Thank you. Andrew, that's fine. Rather than keep you here all afternoon, we'll let you go. But thanks very much for coming. I appreciate the fact that you've come and you explained that. Thank you. I must have been getting DMOB happy because I didn't ask say that we were noting item 3. So if we're agreed to note item 3 as well, we can then progress to item 5. Thank you. So item 5, internal audit, follow-up actions previously agreed by management in response to audit recommendations. And Ken, you're speaking to this one. This is page 77.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. This is obviously a report, the format of which the panel is now very familiar, and the purpose of the report is to update the panel on the result of our follow-up work, reviewing the extent to which previously agreed management recommendations have been completed and implemented, and that's in response to both internal and external audit recommendations. I always sort of preface this report with the important caveat that the panel should note that where actions are indicated as not yet complete, that doesn't mean that there have been no relevant activity under that area or heading, and often that the actions taken or progressed, although not fully complete, will have gone some way to reduce the risk exposure in respect to the weaknesses previously identified. So I'd ask members to bear that in mind. In terms of the substance of the report, section 2.1 to 2.4 addresses actions previously agreed by management in response to internal audit recommendations, and what we've done there, both at the previous panel meeting and we've taken it a step further this time, is that we've where we've got audit recommendations that are not yet fully implemented, we have agreed and got management commitments to revise dates, and those are included in the body of the report. Detail in respect to each of these recommendations and the current residual risk assessed by internal audit is also included at Appendix 1, and I'd particularly draw your attention to the end column of that, where we make effectively a recommendation as to what the panel may wish to do in relation to each of these individual items, based on the extent to which actions to date will have or have addressed the underlying issues, and I'll work through those very shortly with you, if that's okay. Sections 2.5 onwards deals with external audit recommendations, and again, there's no particular issues to highlight there. If I can take you to Appendix 1. These are the areas where we've agreed revised dates, and we're being sort of fairly open and transparent with the panel, so that you can see fully where dates are changing. In terms of those items which are not yet complete, we've basically said you may wish to consider requesting further reports from management. The first of those is on page 82 and relates to the need to complete some of the risk documentation in relation to some of the kind of corporate risks, and we touch on some of those issues later on in the panel's agenda. So I'm making a recommendation that you may wish to consider requesting an update on this from the relevant senior management, which is me in this instance, at the next meeting of the panel. In terms of other items that we've assessed as medium or high, page 83 in terms of the Scottish Attainment Challenge and Pupil Equity Fund, there is some ongoing work to be done there, but you'll see that in the commentary panel at the end of the table that we've obviously reflected on the fact that we did receive the panel has considered recently the national report from Audit Scotland on this topic, and given the management update provided an ongoing work there, that's something that you maybe just note, the revised completion date. The other item that where we've made a recommendation in terms of a follow-up report is on page, sorry, the other ones are on pages 86 and 88 in relation to ongoing work around kind of payroll controls and in terms of ongoing work around self-directed support within social work. And in both those cases, we've assessed them as medium and recommended that the panel simply note the progress made and the revised completion date, and that request that we monitor progress as part of the next follow-up report. So that's a kind of brief overview of quite a detailed report, but I'm obviously happy to take any questions that members have on any aspects.
Thanks, Ken. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Jim, yeah, on you go. You're on mute, Jim.
Sorry, something came up on the screen here. I've got a couple of questions, Chair.
Yep.
If you don't mind. The first one is on page 79, paragraph 2.4. It's and there's a separate report about it, but just the original analysis and investigation into this specifically mentioned disaster recovery and business control. But all of the aspects of the report, business continuity, sorry, all of the aspects of the report since then mentioned disaster recovery. Can I ask, just to be reassured that the business continuity aspects of the two separate arms of disaster recovery and business continuity hasn't been forgotten? You know, there's lots of aspects of disaster recovery, but very little mention of business continuity. And of course, I'm sure everyone understands that as we move through a digital transformation within the council, that all aspects of business continuity and disaster recovery become more important, and the testing and confirmation that the processes in place actually work become more critical. So could someone answer that for me?
Thanks, Jim. Ken, are you in a position to answer that just now?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of bits. I'll maybe invite Katrina to come in, and I'm now regretting letting Andrew go because Andrew heads up business continuity for the council. So I'll deal with that matter in his absence. Just to give the Councillor Hume, I think assurance. I think both all those involved in this aspect recognise the close links between the disaster recovery around our kind of digital and ICT environments with business continuity planning. We are currently undertaking audit work following up previous issues in relation to business continuity planning, and that work is currently underway, and we would expect, in fact, if we had the next meeting of the panel, if there was a next meeting of the panel, we'd hope to be in a position to provide an audit report on that topic prior to the summer recess. So it's very much not been forgotten. I don't know whether Katrina wants to say something about the linkages in practice between disaster recovery and BCP, or whether we want to just pick those up later on. I'll leave that to you, convener, maybe.
Ken, Katrina, do you want to say anything just now, or we'll catch you later?
Well, I think we'll leave any questions around disaster recovery until item 8, but I suppose just picking up on what Councillor Hume said, so the findings that Ken's put in here are on that outstanding action that we've not yet completed. So similar to what we've seen here, you know, we were working on that recommendation and all the way through the last couple of years it was still partially complete, and we've now satisfied that. But that was just one recommendation in a wider report, the majority of which was around business continuity. So again, coming through the panel over the last couple of years, there's been significant information, as Ken said, led by Andrew, on the improvements to business continuity. And as a head of service, just with my own responsibility for my business continuity arrangements, then every year we are required to review our plan and our processes and update it and provide annual assurance statements. So I think probably just give that service perspective, Councillor Hume, that it's absolutely not been forgotten about, and Andrew does lead a corporate working group and regularly reviews that and to check that we've got compliance, and then through the enterprise architecture governance group that I chair, then we make sure that there is always those references to business continuity plans, specifically around the IT systems. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Katrina. Is that fine for you, Jim? Is it? Or you have anything, another question?
No, that's a good, decent response, Chair, for that one. I've got another question though, and it's on page 83, the risk. It's for the SAC and PEF analysis. The thing, and perhaps, well, maybe it's not fair to always ask Ken these things, as opposed to someone in education if they'd be more closely involved in this, but I spoke to a head teacher, and we were talking about PEF and SAC, and she said in terms of PEF, there's little scrutiny done on how head teachers allocate this. And with a joke about a head teacher buying a microwave for the staff room, you know, when it's supposed to benefit pupils. Now, if you benefit teachers, do you benefit pupils? I don't know. But she was quite clear there was little scrutiny on how head teachers spent it. And in terms of SAC, she felt that there were instances where the money benefited teachers rather than pupils. Now, when a head teacher tells you that, you need to think about it, but even me can imagine many circumstances where using SAC to benefit teachers as a corresponding benefit in pupils. But where, and this is what I don't know what the government's saying about this, Ken, and why I'm hoping you can clarify it. Is this a completely unauditable process, and there are no circumstances where the education department or members can have an assessment on how these monies are being utilised? Is that part of the process, or you know, you've already done an audit that found out there were issues with it in terms of market controls and what was the other thing it took? No targets. So is that almost endemic in the processes, or do you feel that we are entitled to ask for more scrutiny and response from the way these monies are utilised?
Thanks, Jim. Ken?
Yeah, in fact, there's quite a lot in there, Councillor Hume. Yeah, where to start? I think on the PEF side, in particular, that scheme was always very much designed, and certainly the Scottish Government's intention was that it was very much monies that they wished to be under the direct influence and control of head teachers, and not effectively, from the Minister's point of view, I suspect, wasted or misdirected by education authorities. Don't quote me on that. So it was always expected that head teachers would have the lead responsibility for determining how that was spent. Now, that should not, and I don't think it's probably fair to characterise that as saying there's no scrutiny, but there's probably in the sense that the schools are required to submit detailed plans for how they plan to utilise that money. But you know, I'm not saying the head teacher is inaccurate if our experience is that there's not any direct scrutiny of how it is actually used. I think both in PEF and SAC, the framework that's been put in place around preparation of annual plans for how those monies are being utilised, and regular reviews of how it is being used do take place. There's in fact, I think education colleagues would probably say in some regards there's quite onerous reporting responsibilities and requirements imposed on them by Scottish Government. I think, you know, we've audited both of those areas in the past, and in fact I think we've done 2 reports in SAC now, and I think, you know, it's an area where, you know, everybody's clear what the intention is, but there's probably not a huge consensus on, you know, how best to use that. So you get a lot of variety. Now some of that variety is a good thing because it reflects local circumstances. There's also this sort of Maoist, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. You know, you kind of, if you do lots of different things, you get a better understanding about what works and maybe what has less impact. But I think one of the challenges from the audit perspective that we've certainly raised with the service is the difficulty in estimating the impact that additional spend and the use of those monies is having. It's quite difficult, you know. Obviously, and again, you know, we looked at some of the information which was presented by the improvement service at the start of the day. You know, there are such huge macro forces going on in terms of impacts on attainment, and the COVID, you know, related attainment gap has got bigger because children from disadvantaged households have generally fared worse in terms of the education experience than families from better off children from better off families. So there's been a lot going on in that space, and I think that's just made the even more complex and complicated the difficulty of assessing, you know, what works and what works best and what represents base value for money. Now, you know, I'm not going to comment, and you wouldn't expect me to comment on the microwave example. I don't know, you know, but you know, the whole idea behind some of that funding was to allow schools to be quite innovative in using the funding in ways which, you know, will have a benefit for their, you know, pupils' cohorts' educational experience, and that's, you know, that was meant to reflect the totality of, you know, what barriers to education, you know, whether the children were coming to school, you know, ill-equipped or ill-prepared, you know, through to, you know, benefiting the teachers by making, you know, providing, upskilling them in particular areas. So, you know, there's a whole variety of different ways, but I think there is a, you know, the Scottish Government have certainly not given us the money and just said, get on with it, we're not interested in how you use it.
Right, Ken, thank you. Jim, are you okay with that?
Yeah, thanks. I completely understand the difficulties with this, and I suspect if I raised the question with education, I'd almost get the same answer as Ken. So we'll leave it there as far as the panel's concerned. Thanks.
Right, Jim, thank you. Alan, spotted you this time.
Thanks, Chair. It was just interesting in Appendix 1 on page 86 and 87. After the discussions we've had about the issues in waste solutions, there's been highlighted the risks from June 2021, and obviously the revised timescales of the 3 different risks they have here on payroll. And I just thought it'd be nice to just point that out, and the fact that the recommendation for one of them specifically is medium and progress. Now, did the issue with waste solutions come from this particular report in June 2021, or was it out with that? Thanks.
Ken?
I'm desperately hoping Paula Henry, who's on the call, is going to nod. My recollection would be that the information which we got as part of that payroll audit did identify the excessive or apparently excessive levels of overtime within that particular area. But it wasn't. It was that alone that generated the audit investigation rather than any concerns raised in the June 21 audit report, if that makes sense. So in other words, it was information we got as part of the audit process, but it wasn't specifically on the back of particular audit recommendations.
I see you're agreeing with that, Paula. Do you want to say anything, or are you fine just to...
Yeah, no, it's just that the employees in question were selected randomly in the sample, which then led to the high levels of overtime being identified. So that was the only thing that came out of this payroll audit.
Thanks, Paula. Alan, are you okay with that? Right, thanks very much. Are there any more questions or comments on item 5? So the recommendations, the panel is invited to note the contents of this report and consider whether there are any issues arising from this report in which they wish to receive further information from relevant management. Now, Ken mentioned the updating risk management, possibly payroll, and self-directed support. Was that your thinking, Ken, was it?
I think the only one that I've specifically said I would recommend is the one in relation to risk. I think the other ones which are marked as medium that you've highlighted were really for the panel. Ultimately, it's your decision rather than mine how you wish to take those forward.
Right. Are we happy just to do the risk management then? Or does MD want payroll and self-directed support to get an update? Are we okay? Right, Ken, we'll do risk management. Thank you.
Chair, I hope you don't mind, but I think the payroll one, I think you've already suggested that we will be getting an update on that. So is it okay to keep that going, because it's already been stated that we will be getting an update on it?
Yeah, I would be happy to keep do an update on payroll too. Ken, are you okay with that? Yeah, that's fine, Alan. Okay, that takes us on to agenda item 6, which is the external audit annual plan 21-22. I think possibly Gillian McCready is speaking on this one. Right, Gillian?
Hi there. Hi there. Thanks for having us today and giving us a slot in your agenda, even though we don't actually have our plan with us. As the covering letter, or the covering report, sorry, mentions, we would normally at this time of year be presenting our annual audit plan for the panel. Instead, I'm going to give you a bit of an update on the status of the audit, mention some of the key points from the plan, and that will cover off why we don't have it with us today. COVID-19 continues to impact how we work at Audit Scotland. The extended timetable for concluding on the 2021 audits has impacted in this year's planning work and us getting started on it. Also, within Audit Scotland, we have completed a review of our audit planning process to improve the quality of our audits. So this has meant that audit work previously conducted after our plan would be issued and presented to the audit and scrutiny panel has now been brought forward and is now required before a plan is shared externally. We've largely completed our audit planning work, certainly what we would normally have completed at this stage, and we expect to share the plan with Elaine and the team very soon. From the work we have completed to date, I can share with you that the financial statements risks identified should be largely familiar to members of the panel. These include the risk of management override of controls. We include this each year, it's required by the auditing standards. Also, risk over non-current asset valuations. Another area of audit focus is likely to be how the insourcing of Culture and Leisure North Lanarkshire is accounted for. So in addition to the work on the financial statements, the public sector audit model extends our responsibilities to the wider audit dimensions. These include financial management, financial sustainability, governance and transparency, and value for money. So our work this year in these areas will be limited to follow-up work, as our planning work to date hasn't identified any new significant risks in these areas. And we'll also be doing follow-up work on the remaining best value recommendations. So, as mentioned, we're aiming to share our draft plan with management very soon, and thereafter we will be circulating our annual audit plan with committee members with as there's no audit and scrutiny panel arranged in the, well, however long given the elections, we will be circulating it perhaps by email. We're hoping to maybe discuss that with the convener and, you know, Ken, to see how that would be best done, and then we're happy to take questions, whether that's by email, or we're happy to arrange any separate meetings or calls if required. The annual audit plan will contain the detailed annual accounts timetable across the business of Audit Scotland. The decision has been made to prioritise health board audits and councils. So the current planned sign-off date would be the 31st of October. And Audit Scotland's quite clear that we continue to take a pragmatic and flexible approach to this. So just to conclude, I would just like to confirm that the panel are content with how we plan to share our plan, and before passing it over to yourselves for any questions you might have, I just wanted to also introduce Pauline Murray, who's with us today. Pauline is joining the team as the new Senior Audit Manager, following Alistair Craig's retirement at the end of the audit last year. So I'll just quickly pass you over to Pauline to briefly introduce herself further, and then we're happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Gillian. Yeah, so I'm Pauline, the new Senior Audit Manager for the North Lanarkshire Council Audit. Brian Howarth remains as the engagement lead, so the appointed auditor. I've been with Audit Scotland now for almost 14 years. Prior to taking up this post, I was part of the team auditing Social Security Scotland. I look forward to working with you all and continuing the good relationships that have been established. So, as Gillian said, we're happy to take any comments or questions you have on the update that Gillian just provided. Thanks.
Standing.
Yeah, right, Jim. Yeah, on you go, Jim.
I'm glad I could get back to you on that one, because you reminded me I was mute earlier on. I just want to make sure I understand Gillian's comments. The accounts that Audit Scotland review are the critical aspect of it, but in the past I have found the external audit recommendations for other processes to be equally as valuable in terms of members understanding where perhaps things could be improved. And I didn't quite get whether you were saying because of COVID and other operational issues you weren't able to do that. You mentioned a couple of things, and then you said we will only be reviewing and updating on our recommendations, or sounded like our previous recommendations. So wouldn't you have time to look at other processes apart from the annual accounts this time in your external audit? Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Hey, Julie?
Oh, yeah, no worries. Well, what we'll be doing is we'll do our financial statements audit as always, and part of that is looking at the kind of control environment. So we'll be reviewing some of the council's key financial controls, and we will be completing work in the wider dimension area. So I listed off the 4 kind of dimensions. We haven't identified any risks, so we always look at these dimensions as part of our planning work, and in the areas that we look at, we haven't identified any risks to do specific audit work in those areas. What we will do is we'll be looking at some of the kind of key things rather than, you know, in previous years we've covered off some additional best value areas, look at qualities, I think that was maybe 2 years ago, for example. What we'll be doing is keeping it contained to, you know, we look at financial management, the financial controls, budget monitoring. Each year we look at financial sustainability, so we'll keep doing that, looking at the council's medium-term plans, budget gaps going forward. So our report that will come to you at the end of the year will still contain that kind of work, but there's no kind of additional specific work. As we're in year 6 of the audit, we've covered off a lot of those kind of base value topics previously. So we'll be really looking to kind of look at the standard areas, and yes, additionally we will be following up. I think there's 3 of the 8 best value recommendations that we haven't closed off yet. So we'll be going back and looking at them again and getting the most up-to-date picture of them, how they've progressed, and see if we can class them as complete along with the other 5 that we've already done that with.
That's okay, thanks, Chair.
Right, thanks, Jim. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Gillian or Pauline? Are we okay? Well, just to say thank you very much to both of you for coming. We look forward to continuing working with Pauline and the good connection we have with Audit Scotland. And thanks very much for your time today and your explaining the future, how it's going to appear. Thank you both. You can we'll let you go unless you want to stay, but you can go if you like, rather than sitting through the rest of the meeting. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're getting through. We're on to agenda item 7, page 95. Changes to the Code of Practice, Local Authority Accounting 21-22. And Elaine is going to speak to this one. Elaine?
Yep, thanks, convener. This is a reasonably short and very straightforward report. I bring it to the panel every year just to highlight where any changes to the accounting codes may have an impact on the council's accounts. This year, or coming for 21-22 accounts, there are 3 main changes. They're listed in section 214, but none of them will have a material impact or any real change on what we do. The report gives also an update on the implementation of the new standard relating to accounting for leases, and this is something that I've brought to the panel for discussion previously. It was that standard was originally due to be implemented in April 2019, but a delay has been reported previously. A further delay is now likely, and we expect it now to apply to the 22-23 accounts. So finally, Financial Solutions continues to track the position on leases, but again, the impact will not be material, and I've reported that to the panel previously. And that's all I need to say at this time, convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elaine. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Are we fine? So agenda item 7, recommendations, acknowledge the contents of the report and recognise the actions being taken to ensure the council submits a fully compliant annual accounts to external audit. We're happy to note that. Thanks very much. So we're on to agenda item 8, which is the risk management update, and Ken's going to speak to this item.
Yeah, thanks, convener. Yeah, the purpose of this report is really to provide the panel with a general update on risk management developments. Section 2 starts off by providing an update on the current status of the current corporate risk register, and we've provided at paragraph 2.4 some narrative there in respect of some of the changes since the last update to the panel. I don't think there's anything hopefully particularly significant or concerning or that requires more detailed explanation, but I'll happy to take any questions on that. Really just kind of concentrate, particularly highlight a couple of issues on page 101, really just in relation to the previous risk that was in relation to health and social care integration and the council's relationship with the IJB. Your members will be aware of the Scottish Government's intention to take forward National Care Service. The exact kind of form of that is obviously still awaited, but CMT have considered these proposals. There was a kind of response to the consultation which has been in front of elected members, and I think there's a recognition that depending on the nature of the detailed proposals and the timings of those proposals, that there are potentially a range of significant strategic, financial and operational risks to the council that will need to be reflected in the corporate risk register for 2022-23. We've previously also highlighted at the last meeting ongoing work in relation to increasing pressures around supply chain, both in terms of availability and price, and obviously that's extremely topical this week in terms of the inflationary pressures that we face, and also increasing workforce pressures, and we've provided an update on those. And finally, just in relation to sort of following on, I think from Councillor Hume's earlier consideration about SAC and PEF, a recognition that sort of educational attainment probably needs to be reflected in the corporate risk register. There's a work ongoing at the moment. At section 2.5 onwards, we outline just the process that we're about to kind of kick off the annual refresh of the corporate risk register review, and that will obviously need to reflect a whole range of things, including the updated programme of work for 22-23, which was approved at Policy and Strategy last week. But clearly, in the context of the council's operations, there are some fairly important strategic things going on in the environment within which the council is operating that we need to make sure are adequately reflected, whether that's sort of uncertainties around future organisational and constitutional structures, the economic challenges that the council faces, ongoing pressures around financial sustainability, the ever increasing difficulties and challenges around addressing equalities or inequalities, and then the more internal things around performance, innovation, increasing use of digital, and then issues around leadership, workforce and governance. So all of those will be reflected as part of the process by which we update the risk register, and we'll bring that back to, once that's approved at CMT, we'll bring that back to a subsequent meeting of the panel. The rest of the report just highlights a number of ongoing issues, and I think it's important that members just reflect on the fact that risk management is now, I think, increasingly embedded within services, and that risk registers are in place across the organisation with work ongoing within those services to make sure that those registers remain comprehensive, up to date, and reflect current organisational objectives and management arrangements. So that's probably all I want to highlight, Convener, but I'm happy to take any comments or questions.
Thanks, Ken. Does anybody have any questions or comments on agenda item 8? Are we okay with that? Now, this one's for approval. So the recommendations, the panel is invited to note the risk management progress and activity undertaken in the last period, agree to the timetable for the future submission to panel of the revised 22-23 corporate risk register, and agree to the future submission of a proposed timetable for providing detailed risk lead reports on individual corporate risks. Are we happy to approve that? Yeah, okay, right, thanks very much. So that takes us on to agenda item 9, risk management update, additional corporate risk, administration of elections. It's all yours, Archie.
Thanks, Convener. I would say that project management and risk assessments have always been embedded in the election process, but that's sat quite separate from the council's corporate risk register. The catalyst for bringing elections into the corporate register has really been the pandemic, and in 2020 going into 2021, the number of initially by-elections and then full elections that we were involved in as a team, obviously having regard absolutely carefully to the Scottish Government's guidance, and how that impacted on delivering safe electoral processes, not just for our own staff, but obviously for candidates and agents and members of the public coming into polling stations. So that's the background to all of this. You'll see from the covering report that a number of management actions have already been taken, having regard to the very much COVID-based safeguards, and also a number of actions are in the process of being implemented, obviously in time for the local government elections on the 5th of May. And attached to the report is the deep dive review, which, as I say, has very much a focus on COVID and the safeguards that are required, and will actually be updated in terms of the Scottish Government guidance, which was issued on the 21st of March on the back of the recent announcement from the First Minister. But it's also the wider risks around elections, which, as I say, have always been a feature in terms of the work of the team. I don't propose, Convener, to go through the deep dive review. I think it clearly sets out, not just in terms of what we do as a team, but also our links to other stakeholders, contractors, and other agencies. So I'm happy to take any questions on either the covering report or indeed the review itself. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Archie. It shows the seriousness of this when you look at the detail about the Newcastle 2 senior officers were suspended because it obviously people weren't able to vote, and I think probably voting is on everybody's mind at the moment anyway. So it is. We have to be absolutely, totally 100% with this.
Yeah, I
Are
have
there
to
any
say,
questions? Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, you know, anecdotally perhaps, but also through the media, we do hear reports year on year in terms of some disasters that have taken place in the election process out with North Lanarkshire, I hasten to add. So it's all about making sure there are lessons learned from elsewhere, but also lessons learned internally in terms of always developing better practice.
Absolutely, Archie. Ken, were you wanting in there?
Yeah, really just to add, I mean, I think I've had the discussion with a number of chief executives that the two things that are likely to get them the immediate departure are you know, fouling up elections and significant public protection failures, and those are two areas that you'll see are, you know, have got high levels of inherent risk, and I think it's significant that they're both reflected on in the corporate risk register. Clearly, you know, significant failings in this area would bring huge reputational risk to the council. But as Archie's saying, the processes that are in place are hopefully this report hopefully gives the members some comfort that those are you know, comprehensive and robust. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say it's in good hands. So, do you have any questions or comments on item 9? So the recommendations is to consider whether there are any issues arising from this report on which the panel requires to receive further information, otherwise give consideration to the contents of the report. Are we fine with that? Okay, right, that's item 9. And we're on to the...
Convener, sorry.
Sorry?
I wonder if I might be excused. I don't think I've got anything else.
Yes, fine, Archie. Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. So we're on to item 10, which is the update and actions to assure disaster recovery processes. And Katrina's going to take us in this one. Katrina?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So through regular Q&As that have taken place at previous panel meetings, members are familiar with our disaster recovery arrangements and the status, and this report is looking to summarise for you the activities that have already been undertaken to meet the recommendations highlighted at paragraph 1.1, as well as those improvements that myself and my subject matter expert officers believe actually require further attention and focus on our improvement roadmap as we go forward. So the background section highlights the audit recommendation on disaster recovery and the commitments that I previously gave in 2019 to develop risk-based standards. The background section also explains why DR arrangements can't stand still and provides context on why our division is resourcing an extensive impact assessment and a refresh process over the next year. Moving on to section 2 of the report, it reminds members of the details that were considered over the last couple of years, largely in the responses to Ken's follow-up reports, and it's specifically highlighting when the DR plan was reviewed and summarising the testing programme that's in place. Paragraphs 2.4 and 2.6 reference the new ICT DR and resiliency standard that is now used to determine the testing frequency of all of our systems. Paragraphs 211 to 215 provide additional details of our improvement roadmap and the intent to regularly report the progress against that to the T&D committee or the equivalent that's got that remit going forward. Resourcing is an issue on two fronts. Firstly, backup arrangements cost money to maintain and to test, so they've got to be based upon the importance and the value of the data that's held within those systems. And what that basically means is not everything can be gold. So there will still be risks to data, its availability, ability to actually recover it. And that picks up really on the point that Councillor Hume was making earlier at item 5 on why business continuity plans and processes are vital. Services have to have that in place, despite everything that we will put in place for disaster recovery. My second point about resourcing is Business Solutions is obviously driving the improvement programme forward, and we've allocated funds towards a dedicated additional post to be able to do that. But that's temporary, but the ongoing need is not temporary. So it means that we are going to be trying to balance, I guess, the requirement for good modern DR against everything else on an ICT front that Business Solutions is taking forward. And none of that is likely to ease. And I suppose all of that needs to be considered in the round, convener. That's probably all of the points that I would like to make. I'm happy to hand back to you just to bring Rob in if there's any detailed questions around the report itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Jim, yes, you've got a question. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll take this offline if necessary, but I noticed on page 118, 1.6, it mentions that we're migrating on-premises system to Azure and the cloud. Is that bespoke systems that we're introducing, or is it using the existing applications that are included in Azure currently? So do we amend our processes to suit the apps on Azure, or do we get a bespoke app created and put on Azure where it's stored in the cloud? If the answer for that's not clear, we'll take it offline. A brief answer would be appreciated, though.
Thanks, Jim. Katrina or Rob, who wants to take that?
I'll come in first, convener, and Rob can maybe provide something more practical. So it's linked into your standard, Councillor Hume, and I'm happy to get you more information on the applications that have migrated over and any further information. But yeah, absolutely, we can make it bespoke, and so far those who have moved across have largely been aligned with the new tools that were brought in for digital technology. So the easier ones to migrate over, you know, so we've not done anything that's a legacy system that we're likely to replace. So it's been all of our kind of smaller systems and servers, etc., that have been migrated across. But if you want any specific detail, get in touch and we'll get that for you.
Okay. Thanks, Katrina. Is that fine for you, Jim?
Yes, thanks.
Right, thank you. Any further questions on item 10? We okay? Right, this is for noting again. Panel is invited to consider the content of the report and actions associated with provisioning modern disaster recovery processes, and recognise that DR practices need to be considered as ongoing business as usual activities and therefore require resources to be targeted at them on an ongoing basis. Are we happy with that? Okay, right, thanks very much. And that takes us on to item 11. Which is the ALIOS, Governance and Risk Management Oversight and Assurance Report. And this is you again, Katrina.
Chair Jennifer's actually going to take us through that. She's on the call today, if that's okay with yourself.
Perfect. That's fine, Jennifer. Yeah.
Thank you and good afternoon, members. This is the now well-established monitoring report that comes to the panel, and it provides you with oversight of governance, including financial governance in the ALIOS where the Council has an interest. The report is produced jointly with our colleagues in Financial Solutions, and they provide the financial oversight that is referred to. And although members are aware the number of ALIOS that the Council now has reduced in recent years, you'll see from page 126 that we do still have interest in a number of outside bodies that are delivering frontline services such as the repair service, the roads and winter maintenance service on behalf of the Council. And as such, under our following the public ground obligations, there's a duty on the Council to ensure that these services are being delivered as per members' expectations to a high standard and are achieving best value. Performance is reported 6 monthly to the relevant service committee, and you'll see in Appendix 1 that the report lists each of the ALIOs where the performance is reported and provides a date of the last performance report to the committee. We also have a range of wider performance and controls, and these are referenced on pages 127 to 128 of the report, paragraphs 2.41 and 2.47, and range from the appointment of a client monitoring officer to ensure services are being delivered that meet the council and our customers' requirements, to the appointment of elected members to serve on the boards or management committees, and that provides an opportunity for members to ensure that the individual company's business objectives are aligned to the council's strategies and the plan for North Lanarkshire in particular. I'm pleased to advise that there are no new substantial matters which require to be brought to the panel's attention on this occasion. The financial monitoring has identified that North Lanarkshire properties and mayors continue to feel the impact of COVID on company trading in financial terms, and as such, both management committees members and Financial Solutions are maintaining robust oversight of the financial position and trading operations during the financial year. The recommendations are contained on page 125 of the report, and I'm happy to take any questions, convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Yes, Jim, you've got a question?
Yes, thanks again, Chair. On page 129, item 2.9, it says at the last sentence, a number of outstanding final issues in relation to CLNL Limited being brought back in-house. I don't know if there's an answer yet, but I wondered if members of some committee, whether it's the panel or another committee, will receive a report when CLNL is finally bedded in and the analysis has been completed and all the issues have been resolved about how the transfer took place. I know, as I say, will there be an internal report? I know external audit have said they will produce a report on insourcing CLNL as well, but I wondered if the officers would prepare another report for some committee or panel.
Thanks, Jim. Jennifer, do you want to answer that, if you can?
Yes, certainly the matters relating to culture and leisure North Lanarkshire, they are largely matters to do with the dissolution and wind up that are out with the council's concern. For example, the deregistration for VAT purposes. We know that HMRC has experienced a backlog and has been impacted by COVID, and therefore the time taken to be deregistered for VAT has taken longer than we anticipated, and that's the case with both Culture and Leisure North Lanarkshire and indeed with Campsies, which is also going through the process of being struck off, Councillor Hume. Certainly there is a project plan in place that monitors just where we're at with the dissolution and wind up, and what I could do is provide an update in the next 6 monthly panel report to this panel, albeit we have the elections on the 5th of May before then, just giving that confirmation of where we are with the final strike-off and wind-up of Culture and Leisure North Lanarkshire.
Thanks, Jennifer. Are you fine with that, Jim?
I would appreciate that. Thanks, Chair.
Right, thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments on item 11? So if we look at the recommendations, this one's for approval. Consider the governance and risk management arrangements within the council's arm's length service delivery providers and confirm that these remain sufficiently robust, providing assurance to the council that the entities delivering services on its behalf are effectively managed, and referencing the head of Financial Solutions assessments in relation to the impact of COVID on individual companies, agree that the relevant boards or management committees should continue to monitor financial performance closely, along with ongoing separate oversight by Financial Solutions. Are we actually happy to accept that and approve it? Fine, yeah, thank you. Well, that's item 11 passed. This obviously is the last meeting of this Audit and Scrutiny Committee for this term. Can I say, first of all, thanks very much to Ken Adamson, who really has made my life as convener so much easier by being so much on top of the job and has been so helpful to all the sometimes difficult questions, something stupid questions I've asked him. He's kept me right, and I really appreciate your help, Ken. Can also thank Leslie, Paula, Linda, Jennifer, Kirsty, Susan, Rob, Elaine, Katrina, and Archie. Now, if I've left anybody out there, sorry, but for everybody's input to make this session of the Audit and Scrutiny panel a success and flowing smoothly. As far as the councillors are concerned, those councillors who are standing down, can I wish them all the very best for their more relaxing life, hopefully, ahead. And for the councillors who are standing again for re-election and being non-political, can I wish them all the very best for their re-election, because you've all had good input to the panel. So thank you very much, and no doubt we'll see you in due course. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, convener.
Yeah, thank you.